Hello, Year 11. I'm back again, and we're going to do another English language revision video today. So as you can see on the screen, what we're looking at this time is the June 2018 AQA Paper 2, Writers' Viewpoints and Perspectives. So that's the paper that we are going to be working with. And as with all the papers that I do online for you, this one is available to all members of the general public from the AQA website. And I will put the links in the description underneath so you can download your own copy of the paper and print that off and work along with me if you like. Obviously, my students have a look on Teams, and I'll put the paper on Teams for you that you can work on there. So that's what we're going to be up to. So what I'm doing in this particular video is going to do a walk through preparing the exam paper, which I like to do, and I'm going to try and explain to you why it's really important to do this as I go as well. I think people always want to rush into answering the paper, but that can really get you into a pickle on the paper. It is really, really good practice to spend a bit of time just getting to know your way around the paper and being really, really clear before you start writing of what is required of each question. So I'm going to be kind of annotating and marking up the paper live along with you today. And so the first thing, obviously, if you're in the exam room, or if you're in your classroom doing a timed assessment, before the actual assessment starts, you have to read through the front of the paper and fill out the front of the paper yourself. So make sure you know your centre number and your candidate number, obviously, and then read through this. So the time allowed for the paper is 1 hour and 45 minutes. So that's your 45 minutes for section A reading, your 45 minutes for section B writing, and then approximately 15 minutes of reading time. Just to remind you, you need source A and source B, which are a separate insert, and that's like a little booklet or a fold out that you'll have in the exam. You need to answer all the questions. There's no optional ones on paper 2. You need to write in black, and I've talked before about how your exam papers get scanned in, so writing in black is important. Ask your examiner or your teacher if you need to borrow a pen. Fill out the top, good. Answer the questions in the spaces provided. Write inside the lines. Do your rough work in the book. Sometimes you can pick up extra marks for your rough work, so it's always worth doing your plans in your book. It says cross through any work you don't want to be marked, but I always say don't go mad with your crossing out. Kind of leave it there, unless you know you've made a spelling mistake. That's different. So leave your planning there uncrossed out. Use the insert booklet, obviously, and don't use a dictionary. So just don't. In information, the marks for each question are shown in brackets. So remember, I always use the tip minute per mark. So the marks are really important if you're going to follow that tip. 40 marks for section A and 40 marks for section B. So just because section B is only one question, the argumentative writing, doesn't mean it's less important than section A. Section A is a slog, and for many of you, section B can be quite pleasurable in contrast, but that doesn't mean you should not divide your time up equally. And you need to use good English and clear presentation in your answers throughout, but especially good English in section B, in the writing section. And the quality of your reading will be assessed in section A. So it's all your analysis and your inference and your comparisons and so on. Whereas your argumentative writing is assessed in section B. And then it gives you your tips for the top. About 15 minutes reading through all the sources and the questions, which is basically what we're going to do today together. Plan your answer to question 5 before you start to write. I'd also suggest that doing a plan for question 2 and question 4 is quite useful as well. And make sure you've got sufficient time to check your answers. So as you can see here, 40 marks for section B and 40 marks for section A. If you're following my minute per mark, that should leave you 5 minutes to check on section A and 5 minutes to check on section B. That's kind of built in. So what are we going to do next? And we're going to read through those questions. When the examiner or your teacher says you may start, then you can open your insert and your question paper. So question 1, remember, is your true or false question. So let's think about our exam technique, shall we? So read again the first part of the source A from lines 1 to 13. Choose 4 statements which are true. So what I'm going to do is go straight into that source. It's source A. So let's just do a little gentle bit of highlighting. It's source. Oh no, I don't want to do that. Oh well, yellow it is now. Ah, there we go, that's better. Let's pick a highlighter pen instead. There we go, try that again. Source A. And we're looking at lines 1 to 13, and we're choosing the 4 statements which are true. So like I said, let's go into source A, the source A. And what did it say? Lines 1 to 13. And you can see it's really mean compared to the other paper, because in this one they are not going to put a star there or anything like that. However, what they do is they do write 13 there. So we're only looking at this bit for question 1. It's question 1, lines 1 to 13 in source A. So that's the first thing that I'm thinking about. And if I actually read through these, first time my daughter saw anyone surfing in 1953. He didn't spend much time at the beach as a child. In the 50s, there were very few surfers. Most surfers likely to surf in the morning. Surfers stay later in the day to entertain the crowds. Took the train to the beach. He was unimpressed by the surfers, and surfers looked fit and suntanned. And I'm looking at that, and already I'm kind of getting some ideas for question 1 before even doing any reading. Right, let's have a look at question 2 then. And again, I'm thinking about my exam technique here. So we're looking at both sources, source A and source B for this one. So it's both of them. Both sources describe the types of board. Okay, that's quite specific, isn't it? Okay, so I'm really zooming in on that word board. Use details from both sources to write a summary. So that's the reading skill they're going to be marking of what you understand about the different boards used by the surfer. So it's just about the boards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in here, and I'm just going to write Q2 boards. No, not boats, boards. Question 2, boards. That's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Q2 boards. So when I read through the sources, I know that that's what I really need to think about for my question 2. Now, before I move off of annotating question 2, I'm going to just remind myself of the technique that I'm going to use here, and that is the SQI technique, which stands for statement, quotation, and inference. Okay, so I'm just going to write that in my exam paper at the top of the paper. I'm going to remind myself that it's 8 marks. So even though I've got to write about 2 sources, I've only got 8 minutes to do that. So that's quite a tough thing to do. So now I'm going on to question 3. You need to refer to source B. So I'm going to get this highlighted. Source B from lines 18 to 25. So it's quite a short bit of text, and it's kind of in the middle of the text, and it's from source B. So I'm going to need to read through source B before I do that. So I'm going to go back to source B. So here's source B, and I've forgotten already what lines it said to look at. So I'm going to go back there. 18 to 25. Okay, 18, 25, 18, 25. Right, 18's marked up for me there. Look. It's just this paragraph basically, isn't it? So it's this paragraph here, and this is question 3. When you're writing in the exam, you won't be writing with a mouse, so you'll be able to do this a lot quicker. So that's what I'm looking at to analyse the language. That's nice, that's quite short. I'm going to go back up here now. That's question 2. Question 3. How does the writer use language to describe the surfers and the sea? The surfers and the sea. And there's 12 marks, so I've got 12 minutes for this one, which is nice. That's a nice chunk of time. So what I'm going to just type here by this paragraph to remind me is lang for language, surfers, sea, so that when I come back here I know that that's what I'm focusing on, the language and the surfers and the sea. So any metaphors, similes, technical vocabulary, whatever, that's what I'm going to be looking out for. Okay, right, question 4 is the tough one. Oh, sorry, back to question 3 first. Yeah, what technique are we using here? Well, the technique that I always use is PEA with a optional S in it, and that stands for points, evidence, quotations, analyze. So zooming in. And just to remind you not to be really basic with this, S for symbolize. So what does it symbolize? Symbolize. Let's put an M in there so it actually makes sense. Symbolize. Okay, that's the technique that I'm going to be using for question 3 just there. Okay, so let's go back to question 4 now. Yeah, like I said, this is a tough one. For this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. It's a lot of reading, but hopefully by the time you come to question 4, you'll know those sources quite well. Compare, so there's a keyword there, let's get that highlighted. Compare how the writers convey their different perspectives on surfing. So how do they convey their different perspectives on surfing? So those are our key words. You could compare their different perspectives on surfing. Yeah, great, that's what it says in the question. Compare the methods that the writers use and support your response with references to both texts. You need to write about both the texts on this one. What I will just type here is what can perspectives mean as well. So what we're looking for is perspectives. Another way of saying that is points of view on surfing. We're looking for mood words because if we can identify what the mood is, what the attitude is, then that helps us to understand what the perspectives or the points of view are. Okay, so that's what perspectives kind of means. Okay, different ways of putting perspectives. And the mnemonic that we're going to use for this one is PEMA. And it's PEMA A, B, A, B, A, B. And PEMA stands for point. No, it doesn't. It stands for point of view or perspective. Evidence, got to use that evidence, that's your third bullet point. Method, so what does it say there? Methods the writers use. And analyze, or zoom in. And then you do the AB stands for a PEMA on source A, and then you compare or contrast it with a PEMA on source B. So if their perspective on surfing is the guy in source A loves it, but the woman in source B hates it, your first PEMA would be about to prove that how he loves it, and then your PEMA on source B to be to prove why she hates it, and you just use a little contrast in between your A, B. So that's the technique we're going to use there. So we'll have a go at doing that together in another video. So that's what we're doing there. So it's all about surfing. I don't feel like I need to go and annotate the source for that because both of the articles are about surfing, and that's why it is about everything. We'll just have to pick carefully when we get there. Okay, and then finally, we're going to think quickly about section B, the writing section. So just to remind you again, you need to spend about 45 minutes on this section. You desperately need to write in full sentences here because you get marked for your writing. You do need to plan your answer, and you definitely should leave at least 5 minutes to check through your writing at the end. Let's have a look at the statement then. All sports should be fun, fair, and open to everyone. These days, sports seem to be more about money, corruption, and winning at any cost. Okay, this is cool. So we're thinking about money, and I'm immediately getting some ideas, thinking about all the money in the Premier League. I'm thinking even with coronavirus at the moment, like they're still trying to charge you ridiculous amounts of money to watch games on pay-per-view. Corruption. Again, I'm thinking of football, and I'm thinking about the bidding process for the World Cup and how on earth did the World Cup end up in that strange little country of Qatar. That seems quite corrupt there. Lots of people in FIFA ended up being fired, didn't they, because of corruption. Can you think of any other sports that are a bit corrupted? And then winning at any cost. This makes me think about cheating in sport. So I'm sure that lots of you can think about athletes who've cheated, cyclists who've cheated, even cricketers who've cheated. I'm thinking of ones who, boxers and cricketers who've thrown matches on purpose, actually, even snooker players. So lots of ideas coming into my head for this argument here. I like these 3 words. You're just going to have to start really triggering your general knowledge here to help you write a really, really good answer. And then I'm thinking to myself, the next bit we've got, it is going to be an article for a newspaper. So I'm thinking, what do I need to know for an article for a newspaper? It always says this, rather vaguely, explain your point of view. Or if you're giving your point of view, it's an argument, isn't it? And on this statement, so who said it, why did they say it, and so on. And we'll look more about picking this answer apart. And just to remind you, we are going to use a little 5-paragraph structure on this. But again, we'll come back and do a plan before we write our answer. So there we have it. We've read through all the instructions at the beginning. We've read through and annotated up each question so we know what's coming. And the bits where we have to look at specific lines, we've also got those annotated up. So there's no excuse for using the wrong source or analysing the wrong lines or summarising the wrong bit. Okay, so that's what we've done so far. Before I end this video, what I would like to do is read through source A and source B. So I'm going to read those to you, and we're going to just think about these focuses that we've been given here as well. Okay, so we've got a little bit of blurb in the box. Before we read the blurb, let's have a look at the blurb on the front of the insert. So our source A is our 20th century literature. So that means it should be slightly easier to understand, maybe. It's called Morning Glass, and it's an extract from Mike Doyle's autobiography, and it was published in 1993. So that's fairly recent. Source B is our 19th century nonfiction. So that's from the 1800s. That one's called The Hawaiian Archipelago. And this is an extract from a letter written by Isabella Bird. It's published in 1875. So just looking at that date, it might be a bit more difficult to read. So I'm thinking that because obviously there's more than 100 years between these 2 extracts. Let's read through Mike Doyle's one. Source A is taken from Morning Glass, the autobiography of professional surfer Mike Doyle. In this extract, he describes his introduction to the world of surfing at the beach near his home in California in the 1950s. And they helpfully give us a little picture to show us what surfing looks like in case you're not short. And believe it or not, there were some complaints after this paper that some people didn't know what surfing was and they couldn't really visualize it. But they did give you a picture to help you. Okay, this is how it goes. The first time I ever saw someone riding a surfboard was at the Manhattan Pier in 1953. As much time as I'd spent at the beach, you'd think I would have seen at least one surfer before then, but there were only a few dozen surfers in all of California at that time. Unlike surfers today, they were out at dawn surfing the morning glass. By the time the crowds arrived, they were gone. But this one morning, I took the bus to the beach, walked out onto Manhattan Pier, looked down and saw these bronzed gods, all in incredibly good shape, happier and healthier than anybody I'd ever seen. And I'm just going to pause there because that was a little extract that you needed for your question 1. So I might be tempted to go and do question 1 now, but I won't in this video. You don't need any of this for question 1 anymore. They sat astride their boards, laughing with each other. At the first swell, they swung their long boards around, dropped to their stomachs, and began paddling towards shore. From my viewpoint, it was almost as if I were on the board myself, paddling for the swell, sliding into the wave, coming to my feet and angling the board down that long wall of green water. It was almost as if I already knew that feeling in my bones. From that day on, I knew that surfing was for me. And I'm going to pause there after the second paragraph because I've, in the back of my mind, got question 2. Question 2 is a summary question about surfboards. Have they talked about surfboards yet? Kind of. So I'm just going to annotate it. Well, not annotate, just highlight it actually a little bit. He talks about them sitting astride their boards. He talks about them being longboards. He's talking about them swinging their boards and dropping into their stomachs. So that's kind of like how they use them. So it's not really about the surfboards, but it is like a little bit. So I'm still going to be kind of watching out for that. Okay, there were several surfers out that day. Greg Knoll was just a kid then, about 16 years old, but he was hot. On one wave, he turned around backward on his board, showing off a bit for the people watching from the pier. I was just dazzled. Once I discovered there was such a thing as surfing, I began plotting my chance to try it. I used to stand out in the surf and wait until one of the surfers lost his board. The boards then were 11 feet long, 24 inches wide, and weighed 50 or 60 pounds. Okay, hopefully you're thinking what I'm thinking. Question 2. Right, first of all, I'm waiting until one of the surfers lost his board. So it tells us a little bit about boards, that you can lose them in the water. But then this whole section is about boards, isn't it? So I'm just going to highlight down the side of that and put a weird little Q2 just there as I read through. So you can see I'm like really actively reading because I know what the questions are that are coming up. Can you see why it's important to know the questions? Otherwise, I might have to read more than I need to. Okay, right. This is also about boards as well. The next bit. Most surfers at that time were riding either hollow paddle boards, and it tells me more, a wooden frame with a plywood shell, or solid redwood slabs, some of them 12 feet long, some more measurements there. The much lighter and better balsa wood boards were just starting to appear. So this is all about, I've highlighted it, or I didn't really need to, I could just sidebar that. Okay, so that's all about boards as well. One day in 1954, when I was 13, I was down at Manhattan Pier watching a guy ride a huge old-fashioned paddleboard, what we used to call a kook box. Still about boards, isn't it? It was hollow, made of mahogany, about 14 feet long, maybe 65 pounds, had no fin. It was a kind of paddleboard lifeguards used for rescues. They worked fine for that purpose, but for surfing, they were unbelievably awkward. When the guy came out of the water, dragging the board behind him, I asked if I could borrow it for a while. He looked at me, "Get lost, kid." But when he sat down on the beach, I pestered him until he finally shrugged and nodded towards the board. I'd watched enough surfing by then to have a pretty clear idea of the technique involved. I dragged the board into the water and flopped on top of it. After a while, I managed to paddle the thing out beyond the shore break and got it turned round. To my surprise, after a few awkward tries, I managed to get that big, clumsy thing going left on a 3-foot wave. I came to my feet, right foot forwards, just like riding a scooter. I had no way of turning the board, but for a few brief seconds, I was gliding over the water. As the wave started to break behind me, I looked back, then completely panicked. I hadn't thought that far ahead yet. My first impulse was to bail out, so I jumped out in front of the board, spread-eagled. I washed up on the beach, dragged myself onto the dry sand, and lay there, groaning. So the other thing that I'm thinking when I'm reading through this is, what attitudes towards surfing are we getting as well? So remember those points of view or perspectives or moods towards surfing or whatever attitudes. And the general overall feeling that I'm getting from this article is his attitude towards surfing. Is it something new? Is something quite rare, even though he's lived by the beach all his life? It's something that he's not really common with. Um, I'm thinking that he is quite enthusiastic about having a go. I'm thinking that this guy also wants to learn and he wants to get on the board and have a go. That he's looking at this big board and he so wants to have a go that he's kind of pestering the guy. So that's what I'm thinking. So I'm beginning to get some thoughts together for question 4 as well as question 2. Right, let's have a look at source B then. So let's read the blurb in the box. In 1875, the British explorer Isabella Bird travelled to Hawaii, an island in the Pacific Ocean. Source B is an extract from a letter she wrote to her sister back in England. So the other one was from a book. This one's from a letter. And the audience for this one's a bit different because, like, it is specifically to her sister. It ended up getting published later. Her sister back in England describing a visit to the Hawaiian town of Hilo. At that time in Britain, surfing or surf bathing was completely unknown. So remember, this is 1875. No one in the UK had ever even heard of surfing. So she's probably having to describe it in quite a lot of detail. Okay, how does it go? Our host came in to say that a grand display of the national sport of surf bathing was going on, and a large party of us went down to the beach for 2 hours to enjoy it. It is really a most exciting pastime, and in a rough sea requires immense nerve. The surfboard is a tough plank of wood shaped like a coffin lid, about 2 feet broad and from 6 to 9 feet long, well oiled and cared for. They are usually made of wood from the native breadfruit tree and then blessed in a simple ritual. So hopefully you're thinking what I'm thinking. You're like, yeah, the surfboard stuff is starting straight away here. So this is Q2. Immediately she starts going on about it, and I'm just using my memory here, but I can see I can see a difference straight away. These ones are 6 to 9 feet, and I think the ones in source A were a lot bigger and longer than that one. She talks about them being well oiled and cared for. I think that's a similarity. Made of wood from the native breadfruit tree. That's going to be a difference, isn't it? Because they use different types of wood in source A, and then these ones are blessed. Okay, so here it seems to be quite a religious thing. So that's quite a difference as well. All right, so straight away, I've only read a tiny little bit, and I'm beginning to get quite a good answer to question 2 together in my head at this point. Let's read on. The surf was very heavy and favourable, and legions of local people were swimming and splashing in the sea, though not more than 40 had their papahe nalu, or wave sliding boards, with them. So that's a little bit about the boards as well. Wave sliding boards with them, and they've got quite fancy kind of Hawaiian name here as well. The men each carrying their own Hand-carved boards. Some more for question 2 here. Under their arms, waded out from some rocks on which a sea was breaking, and pushing their boards before them, swam out to the first line of breakers. We've got a star there. Remember, you've got a glossary. A breaker or a comber are terms used by surfers for a large wave that breaks into the white foam. Okay, so hopefully you can picture that, a breaker, if you didn't know that already. And then diving down, were seen no more till they reappeared half a mile from shore. What they seek is a very high breaker on the top of which they leap from behind, lying face downwards on their boards. So that's about the boards again. Face downwards on their boards. I think that's a similarity, and I think we're going to be looking for differences. As the wave speeds on and the bottom strikes the ground, the top breaks into a huge comber. Remember, that's the same as the breaker, and it explains that in the glossary. The swimmers appeared, posing themselves on the highest edge by dexterous movements of their hands and feet, keeping just at the top of the curl, but always apparently coming downhill with a slanting motion. I'm going to pause there because this is our language paragraph. So let's just think about a little bit about language as we read this. So how is language used to describe the surface and the sea? So they rode in majestically. So majestically is a good word. Kingly. Always just ahead of the breaker. Carried shorewards by its mighty, so again, more kingly kind of vocabulary there, mighty impulse at the rate of 40 miles an hour. So we've got some little stats there. That's quite fast, isn't it? As the more daring riders knelt and even stood on their surfboards, waving their arms and uttering exultant cries. So exultant is also quite kind of religious or kingly kind of vocabulary there. They were always apparently on the verge of engulfment by the fierce breaker, whose towering white crest was either above and just behind them. But just as one expected to see them dashed to pieces, they either waded quietly ashore or, sliding off their boards, dived under the surf and were next seen far out at sea. So we've got a bit of contrast going. There's kind of real exaggeration, power, and noisy language, and that contrasts with this really quiet, gentle language just underneath. So that's something that we might want to think about. And they were seen far out at sea as a number of heads bobbing about like corks, a simile in there, in smooth water, preparing for fresh exploits. So we'll come back when we do question 3 and have a much closer look at that. But straight away you can see, yeah, there's some really powerful language in there, which is good. The great art seems to be to mount the breaker precisely at the right time and to keep exactly on its curl just before it breaks. 2 or 3 athletes who stood erect on their boards as they swept exultingly shorewards were received with ringing cheers by the crowd. Many of the less expert failed to throw themselves on the crest and slid back into the smooth water or were caught in the breakers, which were fully 10 feet high, and after being rolled over and over, disappeared amidst roars of laughter and shouts from the shore. And now I'm beginning to think about question 4, our points of view, our perspectives, our moods, our attitudes, and thinking there's some humour in here. The people who aren't very good at surfing are getting mocked and cheered at. Probably the writer is laughing at them as well. So that's her viewpoint, one of humour. Whereas in source A, it was lots and lots of admiration for the surfers. So that's a little difference there, an attitude or point of view just there. First, I held my breath in terror. So she's not just laughing, she's terrified for these guys as well. So that's a real contrast to the points of view in source A. At first, I held my breath in terror, thinking they were smothered or dashed to pieces. And she repeats that, doesn't she? So this idea that they're all getting smashed up is something that's really panicking Isabella Bird. And then in a few seconds, I saw the dark heads of the objects of my anxiety bobbing about behind the breakers, waiting for another chance. The shore was thronged with spectators, and the presence of the elite of Hilo stimulated the swimmers to wonderful exploits. I enjoyed the afternoon thoroughly. So in a way, we've got another point of view here. She's there as a spectator, whereas the guy in source A, he wants to learn, doesn't he? He watches to kind of learn. Is it always afternoon here, I wonder? The sea was so blue and the sunlight so soft, the air so sweet. There was no toil, clang, or hurry. People were all holiday making and enjoying themselves, the surf bathers in the sea, and hundreds of gaily dressed men and women galloping on the beach. So we can see there a really different attitude to the surfers. The surfers here draw a much bigger crowd than in source A, don't they? It was so serene and tropical. I envy those who remain forever on such enchanted shores. So actually, although that was the Victorian text from 1875, it was quite easy to understand because she explains everything so clearly for someone who's never experienced surfing before, her sister in this case. So let's see if we can go back to the beginning and see if we can summarize again why it is so important to prepare the paper. So by reading through all this, it just settles us down and reminds us how much time we've got, how we need to split our time up, and like how to manage things overall. It just settles us and calms us down. By going through the questions first, we can go into the source and make sure that we've got our lines annotated up so that we don't mess it up when we're doing the questions. It's all there, and the bit that we need to write about is all annotated up. For things like question 2, we put the boards, and we put up here as well the boards, and that meant that when we read through, we were looking for those bits. And now when we come to do question 2, we know that we only need to look at these 2 paragraphs here in source A, and for source B, we only need to look at the end of this paragraph, some of this paragraph, and maybe the beginning of this paragraph. So we've really narrowed down what we need to look at for question 2. So when we come on to question 2, that should save us so much time. So we know that when we're reading through, we know which lines we're looking at for our language analysis, and we already know in our mind there's some contrast in there. There's some really kind of powerful, like almost religious or royal language being used. We know that there's some contrast being used there, and some really noisy language and some really quiet language. So we'll hopefully be able to zoom in on that much more quickly when we get to question 3. And for question 4, we've started to think about, as we read through, some of the attitudes and the points of view towards surfing that we've seen in both of the texts. So both of the writers are really enthusiastic about surfing, but one's a spectator, whereas the other one wants to learn. One of them is admiring the surfers in source A, whereas another one is a little bit laughing at the surfers who are more incompetent. Okay, so we're beginning to get together some ideas for question 4. So again, when we get on to question 4, we've already got some idea. We're not just going in there like dry, as it were. Okay, so this is the point of reading through the questions first and then going into the source, because then when we're reading the source, we've been much more active and much more proactive about what we're looking for and why we need to know these things. Okay, so that is the end of this video, and hopefully you feel really, really well prepared for these sources, and I'm really hoping you can understand why it's so important to have a good read through of the questions and the sources before you try to answer the questions. I will see you next time for a little bit of question 1, a little bit of question 2, and we'll see how the time goes, and we might have a think about question 3 as well. Bye.